This is kind of the building block of SAP security. Now, I mentioned, this is kind of just a few teaching points about SAP security for those of you who are very new to the subject. And I mentioned that one of the biggest complexities with SAP security is that you have to explicitly say everything that a user can and cannot do. And SAP security protects all kinds of data in the system. It protects data that's stored in tables, display access to different information, and then also what the users can and cannot do transactionally within the system. So can they create a purchase order? Can they update a vendor master record file, for example? So again, you have to explicitly say everything they can do. So we start at the bottom, which is kind of the biggest building block, and that's the user master record. So the user master record defines the user accounts for enabling access to the SAP system. So this is really controlled by the SAP Security Administrator and mainly used for user administration purposes and authorization management. So what's contained in the user master record? Well, it tells information about the user that it's tied to. So their name, their address, their job title, their logon information, all that kind of stuff. But the other thing that's also stored in the user master record are the roles and profiles, which roles and profiles, I'm going to get into that in a second, but they kind of go hand in hand with each other. People use them interchangeably a lot, but it identifies the roles and the profiles that users are assigned to. And what's contained in those roles and profiles are those authorizations that the users are allowed to perform within the system. Okay. So then we get into roles, and I know this is a pyramid, and roles and profiles should almost be on the same level. And the reason for that is because they're almost one and the same with a few distinct technical differentiators that make them a little bit different. So we'll start with roles because that's the most common term that people hear. So SAP comes with a lot of pre-delivered roles that are a good starting point if you're doing an SAP security implementation, but they're not necessarily the best starting point. You can also create roles from scratch based on those blueprinting and design activities. And the roles are a compilation of transactions and permissions that are assigned to the user master record. And they usually have some commonality against a person's job or a person's, one subset of a person's job. So for example, a role could be defined as sales clerk, but it also could be defined as maintaining sales orders. So there's a couple reasons why you might want to differentiate those, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But basically, it depends how much delimitation you have in your different business process areas. So if you have a lot of people in your sales department, for example, in your company, you might want to do your roles at the task-based instead of job-based levels. You can mix and match them a lot more easily. Otherwise, if you create a role that says, okay, sales clerk, then everyone who's a sales clerk is probably going to get that role, but their job description might not be exactly the same. So you want to be careful with that. Okay. So when you create a role in SAP, you actually do something called generating the role. That's like a technical step that you perform, which makes the role active. When you generate the role, it usually creates one profile, but it can create more depending on how many authorizations are in the role, and that's where it gets a little complicated. So usually roles and profiles are a one-to-one relationship, but sometimes it can be one-to-many if the role is really big. So for example, if it's a sales clerk role instead of a maintaining sales order role, and sales clerks have hundreds of transactions that they need access to and thousands of permissions, then it could be that there's more than one profile associated with that role because profiles can only hold a certain amount of permissions again. So when a role is added to the user master record, the corresponding profile or profiles also gets automatically assigned. Now, in addition to that, SAP does come with a few pre-delivered profiles as well. But they aren't very common. You don't usually assign a profile directly to a user. You usually assign a role to the user, and then the profiles automatically get pulled into the user master record. The only profile that we see sometimes getting assigned to users in development or quality testing systems is SAP All. And that's actually the profile that gives users access to do everything in the system. So that's really the only time that we see profiles added to users. There's also a profile called SAP New. It's the bolt-on to SAP All because since there's been upgrades in the system, those are the authorizations that have been added since the old SAP All profile was created. But really, SAP All is what you often hear people asking or requesting. And for the most part, you have to be really careful because you don't want to give people open wide access to do anything they want to do in the system because SAP controls every part of the business, and you have to be very careful. So we talked about user master record. That's the physical kind of almost document you can think of that links the user to what they can do in the system and also contains information about the users. They get assigned roles and profiles, which are transactions and permissions that they can do in the system. We'll get into that a little bit more. And then these top three tiers of the pyramid are what's actually contained in the role. So let's say that a user wants access to maintain sales orders. There's a transaction that you can add to a role. The transaction is VA01, Victor Alice 01. And that is a transaction that says create sales order. But in order for the user to create a sales order, they do not just need that VA01 transaction. They also need other underlying permissions and authorizations to do those activities. So that's because SAP, when you log into a transaction, SAP is actually checking for permissions in the background, and they're checking to see whether you have those authorizations. So having the T code VA01 transaction code will allow you to get into it, but it may not allow you to create every type of sales order, for example, in every sales organization. So we group certain authorizations by authorization object class. So classes are logical groupings of authorization objects by like business process area. So we have controlling authorization object class, we have finance, we have purchasing, we have sales and distribution, materials management.